For 25 years, Evelyn Carter believed in the foundation of marriage, loyalty, and shared dreams. When she married Jonathan Carter, he was nothing more than an ambitious young entrepreneur, struggling to turn his dreams into reality. He had a vision, a company that would one day grow into an empire, but little financial backing to make it happen. Yet Evelyn, filled with love and unwavering belief in her husband, sacrificed her own dreams to help build his. She had once dreamed of becoming a financial analyst, had even been accepted into one of the top graduate programs in the country. But when Jonathan convinced her that his business idea had the potential to be something great, she set aside her aspirations to become the backbone of their household. While he focused on expansion, networking, and closing deals, Evelyn handled everything else, from managing their finances to ensuring their home ran smoothly. Their partnership was one of balance. Evelyn took care of the bills, taxes, investments, and daily expenses, ensuring that Jonathan had the freedom to grow the company without worrying about the financial burdens of their personal lives. Their financial system worked efficiently, and soon Jonathan's business took off. With his newfound success came a lavish lifestyle, a beautiful house in an upscale neighborhood, luxury vacations to destinations they had once only dreamed about, and a sense of security Evelyn had always longed for. But despite the wealth they accumulated, Evelyn remained grounded. She didn't ask for extravagant jewelry or designer bags, nor did she indulge in unnecessary luxuries. Her happiness came from the belief that their sacrifices, their years of struggle and compromise, had been worth it. They had built something meaningful together. She ignored the small red flags that began to appear as Jonathan's success grew. He was often away on business trips, sometimes without much explanation. Their anniversaries went unnoticed, and when Evelyn gently reminded him, he would apologize but never make up for it. Still, she remained loyal, understanding, and patient. He was under pressure, she reasoned. His business was growing, and with that came added responsibilities. Evelyn never wanted to be the kind of wife who demanded too much attention, so she let him have his space, believing that at the end of the day, they were a team. The turning point came when Evelyn noticed a change in Jonathan's behavior. His phone was always on silent, and he had begun guarding his messages. She caught glimpses of a name that appeared frequently: Samantha Brooks. At first, she dismissed it. Maybe it was an assistant or a new employee. But then came the late night meetings, the last minute weekend business trips, and the distant, distracted conversations. Evelyn's instincts warned her, but she refused to become paranoid. After all, hadn't she spent over 2 decades building a life with this man? Trust was the foundation of their marriage, and she wasn't about to let doubt ruin that. Then, one evening, everything changed. Jonathan came home late, his demeanor cold, his tone emotionless. Evelyn had prepared his favorite dinner, as she had done countless times before. She poured him a glass of wine, hoping to talk to him about the growing distance between them. Before she could say a word, Jonathan placed an envelope on the table. "I'm leaving," he said, his voice devoid of remorse. At first, Evelyn thought she had misheard. Leaving? For a business trip? For a week? A month? But as she opened the envelope and saw divorce papers, reality hit her like a crashing wave. Just like that. No discussion, no warning, no explanation. Her heart pounded in her chest as she searched his face for an answer, for any sign of hesitation, but there was none. "Jonathan, what?" she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've met someone else," he cut in, his tone indifferent. "I'm moving on." The words shattered her. She had given up everything for this marriage, for him. She had supported him, sacrificed her career, and been his anchor during his hardest times. And now he was leaving her behind like she was nothing more than an inconvenient burden. It wasn't just his betrayal that hurt, it was the ease with which he discarded her, as if their 25 years together meant nothing. Still in shock, Evelyn looked down at the divorce papers and saw the address listed under his new residence, a penthouse registered under the name Samantha Brooks. He had already moved on. He had been planning this for months, possibly even years. Evelyn clenched her fists, her mind reeling. How could she have been so blind? Had she really been so naive, believing in a love that no longer existed? Jonathan didn't look at her with guilt or regret. Instead, he sighed as if this entire conversation was an inconvenience to him. "I'll make sure you get what's fair," he added smoothly. "Let's not make this ugly." The audacity of his words burned through her. Fair? How was anything about this fair? She had built this life with him, stood by his side when he had nothing, and now he was offering her scraps. But Evelyn didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply nodded, her face unreadable. Jonathan mistook her silence for defeat. He thought she would walk away quietly, accept whatever settlement he deemed fair. But what Jonathan didn't know, what neither he nor Samantha realized, was that Evelyn wasn't broken, she wasn't defeated, and soon enough, they were about to find out just how wrong they were. The betrayal and the financial trap. Evelyn Carter's nightmare begins. Evelyn Carter had always believed that trust was the foundation of a strong marriage. Even when Jonathan had begun acting strangely, ignoring their anniversary, coming home late, spending more time away on so-called business trips, she had refused to let suspicion creep in. But after the moment he handed her the divorce papers, after he coldly told her that he was leaving for Samantha Brooks, Evelyn realized she had spent years living in an illusion. At first, she thought it was a bad dream, a cruel misunderstanding that would resolve itself. But then came the financial devastation, a nightmare far worse than the heartbreak. For years, she had trusted Jonathan to do the right thing, to respect the life they had built together. But as soon as she began reviewing their finances, she saw the full extent of his betrayal. Evelyn had always handled the day-to-day household expenses, ensuring that their bills were paid on time, managing their savings, and handling tax paperwork. Meanwhile, Jonathan had been in charge of their larger investments, business finances, and real estate holdings. She had trusted him completely, never imagining that one day he would use that trust against her. Her first shock came when she checked their joint bank accounts. They were empty. Every single dollar had been withdrawn, quietly funneled into accounts that Evelyn had never even known existed. The next revelation hit her even harder. The real estate investments that she had assumed they owned together, the properties, the vacation homes, the commercial buildings, had been quietly transferred to Jonathan's company over the past 2 years. Legally, they were no longer shared assets. They belonged to him alone. And the worst part, he had left her the house, but the mortgage was still in her name. He had given her a debt, not security. Evelyn sat frozen, staring at the bank statements, her hands shaking. How long had he been planning this? Her mind raced back to conversations they had years ago. Jonathan had often reassured her, saying, "Don't worry about the big investments, Eve. I've got it under control." And she had believed him, but now she saw the truth. He had been methodically erasing her from their financial life long before he ever handed her those divorce papers. Jonathan had played the game well. The divorce negotiations, Jonathan's arrogance. Evelyn barely had time to process her heartbreak before she was thrown into the brutal world of divorce negotiations. Jonathan, as expected, acted as if everything was a mere formality. "You'll get what's fair," he had said, his voice smooth, patronizing. "There's no need to drag this out, Eve. Let's be adults about it." Fair? That word made her blood boil. What part of any of this was fair? He had not only betrayed their marriage, but he had systematically robbed her of everything: their shared wealth, their investments, their future. And now he expected her to simply accept whatever crumbs he threw her way. The day of their first court hearing, Jonathan walked in with his high-powered attorney, a man whose tailored suit probably cost more than Evelyn's monthly bills. Samantha Brooks sat beside Jonathan, her manicured nails tapping against his arm, her smirk evident as she whispered something into his ear. The way she laughed under her breath, as if Evelyn was nothing more than a joke, made something inside her snap. But Evelyn didn't let it show. She refused to let them see her break. Jonathan's lawyer started his argument, painting Jonathan as a responsible businessman who had simply made wise financial decisions to protect his assets. "Mr. Carter is willing to offer a reasonable settlement," the lawyer said smoothly. My client suggests that Mrs. Carter keeps the house and a small financial stipend. Evelyn felt the weight of those words settle in her chest. Jonathan wanted her to accept a house she couldn't afford to keep, a house that would drown her in mortgage debt while he walked away with millions. The smug look on his face, the way Samantha leaned in and whispered something that made him chuckle, only fueled her determination. They thought she was helpless. They thought they had already won, but what Jonathan and Samantha didn't realize, what they couldn't possibly know, was that Evelyn wasn't going down without a fight. The moment of clarity, Evelyn's resolve. That night, Evelyn sat alone in the house she had once called a home. Every inch of it now felt like a carefully constructed lie. The furniture, the framed pictures, the luxurious decor, it had all been built on promises that meant nothing. She could have cried, she could have given up, but instead she made a decision. She would not let Jonathan win. If he thought she would walk away quietly, he was wrong. Because Evelyn Carter was about to fight for everything he had tried to steal from her, and this time she wouldn't trust him to play fair. She would make sure he lost everything. What Jonathan didn't see. Coming, Evelyn knew she needed to act fast. She reached out to a lawyer, a determined but overworked attorney named Daniel Foster, the only one she could afford at the moment. He was not a big-name divorce lawyer, but he was fierce, relentless, and believed in justice. Jonathan has been moving assets for months, maybe years, Evelyn told him. I need to prove it. Daniel nodded. Then we need to start digging. If he transferred funds to hide them before the divorce, we can fight this. That night, Evelyn began collecting every piece of evidence she had: bank statements, real estate records, old emails that suggested financial decisions had been made without her knowledge. And then the unexpected call came, one that would change everything. Mrs. Carter, this is Charles Carter's lawyer. We need to speak immediately. Evelyn frowned. Charles? Your father-in-law left something behind, something that I believe will change everything about your divorce case. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. For the first time in weeks, hope flickered inside her. Jonathan had taken everything from her. But maybe, just maybe, he was about to lose more than he ever expected. The unexpected will. Evelyn Carter's turning point. For weeks, Evelyn Carter had been trapped in what felt like a never-ending nightmare. Her husband of 25 years, Jonathan Carter, had not only betrayed her with a younger woman, Samantha Brooks, but had also systematically erased her from their shared financial life. She had been left with nothing, no savings, no investments, just a house with an unbearable mortgage, and a divorce case that seemed heavily stacked against her. Jonathan had played his cards well. He had made sure that by the time he left, all their assets were under his name, and Evelyn was left grasping at straws. Or at least, that was what he thought. But everything changed the day she received an unexpected phone call. Mrs. Carter, this is Richard Lawson, attorney for the estate of Charles Carter. I need to speak with you immediately regarding your father-in-law's will. Evelyn froze in place. Charles Carter, Jonathan's father, had passed away a few months earlier. Though he had never been an openly affectionate man, he had always respected Evelyn. But she had assumed, like everything else, his estate had gone straight to Jonathan. Apparently she was wrong. What is this about? She asked cautiously. Richard cleared his throat. I'd prefer to discuss it in person, Mrs. Carter, but I will say this. Your father-in-law was aware of what Jonathan was doing, and before his passing, he made some critical changes to his will. A sense of hope stirred in Evelyn's chest for the first time in weeks. She had no idea what was coming, but she was about to find out. Charles Carter's final decision, a twist no one saw coming. 2 days later, Evelyn sat in Richard Lawson's office, her heart pounding, as he slid a thick legal document across the table. She hesitated before picking it up, scanning the neatly typed words. And then her breath caught in her throat. She read the crucial lines over and over again, not trusting her own eyes. I, Charles Carter, being of sound mind, hereby declare that due to my son Jonathan Carter's infidelities, betrayal, and lack of moral character, I do not leave my estate to him. Instead, I bequeath my entire fortune to my daughter-in-law, Evelyn Carter, as a reward for her loyalty, dignity, and unwavering strength in the face of my son's indiscretions. Evelyn's hands trembled as she processed the words. This couldn't be real. Jonathan was Charles's only son. He had spent his entire life believing that his father's wealth was destined to be his. But Charles had seen through him. He had known about the affairs, he had disapproved of the betrayal, and in his final act, he had given everything to Evelyn instead. What what exactly does this entail? Evelyn asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard smiled slightly. The estate is valued at $75 million. It includes 3 properties, multiple investment portfolios, and a sizable trust fund. Evelyn's mind reeled. Jonathan had stripped her of everything, leaving her to fight for scraps. But now, she had more than he ever expected, more than he had, and he had no idea what was coming. The courtroom showdown. Jonathan's smug. Confidence shattered the day of the next divorce hearing. Evelyn walked into the courtroom, her posture poised, her expression unreadable. Jonathan, as usual, was relaxed, confident, leaning back in his seat as his high-powered lawyer whispered strategies into his ear. Samantha sat beside him, radiant and smug, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against his arm. As Evelyn took her seat, she heard the all-too-familiar whisper from Samantha. "Poor thing," she murmured with a smirk. "She really thinks she's getting something out of this." Evelyn said nothing. She just waited. When the judge called the session to order, Jonathan's lawyer began his usual speech, painting Jonathan as the self-made businessman who had rightfully protected his assets. But then Evelyn's lawyer, Daniel Foster, stood up. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "we would like to introduce new evidence into this case." Jonathan stiffened, his smug demeanor flickering ever so slightly. The judge nodded. "Proceed." Daniel walked forward and handed over a thick folder of documents. The courtroom was silent as the judge scanned the pages, his brows furrowing in surprise. A long pause. Then the shift happened. The judge cleared his throat and turned to Jonathan's lawyer. "This court takes fraudulent asset transfers very seriously," he said, his voice laced with authority. "Furthermore, new developments regarding the estate of the late Charles Carter have come to my attention." Jonathan leaned forward, frowning. "What does that have to do with anything?" The judge ignored him and continued. "It appears that Mr. Carter's father, Charles Carter, has officially disinherited him," the judge announced. "His entire estate, valued at $75 million, now legally belongs to Mrs. Evelyn Carter." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Jonathan went pale. Samantha's smirk vanished instantly. "You're joking," she blurted, her voice breaking. His dad hated her. But the judge merely held up the notarized documents. "These documents are legally binding." Jonathan's lawyer scrambled through his notes, looking for some loophole, some argument, anything. But there was nothing. This was the final decision. Jonathan had lost everything. Samantha's breathing grew ragged as panic set in. "No, no, no," she whispered, gripping Jonathan's arm. "You said we'd be set for life." Jonathan turned to his lawyer, his voice desperate. "Fix this." But his lawyer simply sighed, rubbing his temples. "You don't fix a legal will, Jonathan," he muttered. "This case is over." The moment of victory. Evelyn sat back, her expression calm as she met Jonathan's wide, disbelieving eyes. This was justice. He had taken everything from her, believing he had won. But in the end, it was Jonathan who was left with nothing. And as Samantha realized the depth of their loss, her face twisted in rage. "You planned this," she hissed at Evelyn. For the first time, Evelyn smiled, not out of vengeance, but out of freedom. "No, Samantha," she said softly. "Your mistake was laughing too soon." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Samantha lunged, only to be restrained by security. Jonathan collapsed into his chair, his head in his hands. "And Evelyn?" She stood up, adjusted her jacket, and walked out of the courtroom, leaving behind the ruins of the man who had tried to destroy her. This wasn't revenge, it was justice, and Evelyn had finally won. The downfall of Jonathan Carter. Jonathan Carter had spent years crafting his perfect life, ensuring that everything he touched turned to gold. He had built a business empire, cultivated a reputation as a savvy entrepreneur, and secured the admiration of those around him. He had spent 25 years married to Evelyn, a woman who had supported him at every step, only to discard her when he believed he had found something better. When he left her for Samantha Brooks, he was certain he had made the right move. He had calculated every financial detail, moved assets into his name, drained their accounts, and left Evelyn with nothing but a mortgage she couldn't afford. He had walked away from their marriage feeling victorious, confident that his future was secure. What he never expected was that his carefully laid plans would unravel before his eyes. When the court ruled that Evelyn was the rightful heir to his father's estate, Jonathan felt the first tremor of his world collapsing. He had assumed that the inheritance would go directly to him, that the wealth his father had accumulated over a lifetime was rightfully his. But Charles Carter had seen the truth about his son long before Jonathan ever realized. He had known about the affairs, the deception, and the arrogance, and in his final act, he had stripped Jonathan of everything, leaving his entire $75 million fortune to Evelyn instead. Jonathan sat in stunned silence as the judge read the terms of the will aloud. He barely registered the way Samantha tensed beside him, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his arm. He didn't notice the collective gasp of the courtroom or the way Evelyn sat calmly as if she had already known how this would end. All he could process was the overwhelming sense of loss, the gut-wrenching realization that he was no longer in control. Samantha's voice cut through his thoughts, sharp and incredulous. "You told me you had money," she hissed under her breath. "You said we were going to be set for life." Jonathan's mind scrambled for a solution, but for the first time in his life, he had none. "Fix this," he barked at his lawyer, but the man only sighed, rubbing his temples in frustration. "You don't fix a legally binding will, Jonathan," he muttered. "This case is over." The weight of those words crushed him. Evelyn owned everything now, the properties, the investments, the trust fund. The life he had so confidently built had just been handed to the woman he had abandoned. His lawyer's words continued to echo in his mind, but they were soon drowned out by something even worse. Samantha's laughter. It wasn't the amused, flirtatious laugh she had once used to draw him in. This was different. It was bitter, sharp, edged with fury. "I can't believe I wasted my time on you," she snapped. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor as she grabbed her purse. Jonathan reached for her arm, panic creeping into his voice. "Samantha, wait!" She yanked away from him, her eyes flashing with contempt. "Don't beg," she spat. "It's pathetic." Without another word, she turned on her heel and strode toward the exit, leaving Jonathan alone in the wreckage of his own making. His phone vibrated in his pocket. For a moment he let it ring, his hands too numb to move. When he finally pulled it out, his stomach dropped at the sight of the notification. A massive withdrawal had just been made from his personal account. Samantha. She had drained everything he had left. His fingers hovered over the screen as realization settled in. She had been planning this for months, just as he had once planned to cut Evelyn out of his life. He had been so blinded by his own arrogance that he never saw it coming. His knees nearly buckled beneath him. The betrayal, the financial ruin, the public humiliation. It was too much to process. He had lost everything. And then the final blow came. The IRS had been investigating him quietly for months, but now, with the court documents exposing the asset transfers, the full scope of his fraudulent financial dealings came under scrutiny. In his desperation to hide money from Evelyn during the divorce, he had unknowingly committed tax fraud. The penalties were severe. The looming threat of prison was real. Every connection he had once relied on in business had severed ties with him. His once loyal investors had pulled out, unwilling to be associated with a sinking ship. Within weeks, his company, once thriving, was on the verge of collapse. Meanwhile, Evelyn flourished. She sold the properties she didn't need, invested wisely, and took back control of her life in ways Jonathan never anticipated. She had never sought revenge. She had simply taken what was rightfully hers and used it to rebuild. While Jonathan spiraled further into ruin, Evelyn traveled, invested in charitable causes, and found peace in a life free from manipulation and deceit. And then, in his final act of desperation, Jonathan called her. He had lost everything: his money, his reputation, his future. The IRS was closing in. Samantha was gone. He had no one left. The phone rang once, twice before Evelyn answered. For a fleeting moment, he thought she might help him, that maybe, after everything, she still had enough compassion to offer him a way out. "Evelyn," he said, his voice raw. "It's me." There was a pause on the other end, a silence that stretched long enough to make him sweat. When she finally spoke, her voice was cold, distant. "That sounds like a you problem," she said simply, and then she hung up. Jonathan sat in silence, staring at his phone. The reality of his downfall settled over him like a suffocating weight. The man who had once prided himself on being untouchable had been reduced to nothing. Evelyn never heard from him again. 1 year later, she sat on a sun-drenched balcony, sipping coffee, reflecting on the life she had built for herself. She had never remarried. She had never needed to, because the greatest revenge wasn't in watching Jonathan suffer. It wasn't in taking his money, his business, or his status. It was in living well. And as she looked out over the ocean, she realized the truth that had been in front of her all along. She hadn't lost Jonathan, she had escaped him. And that was the greatest victory of all: Evelyn Carter's path to freedom. Evelyn Carter had spent the last year discovering what life could be when it was truly her own. For so long, she had been defined by her marriage, by the sacrifices she had made for a man who had thrown her aside the moment he no longer found her useful. But that life was behind her now, and in its place was something far greater: independence, clarity, and a sense of fulfillment she had never known before. In the immediate aftermath of the divorce and courtroom battle, Evelyn had taken time to let everything sink in. The inheritance from Charles Carter had been a turning point, not because of the wealth itself, but because it had been the first time in years that she had something that was entirely hers. It was more than just money. It was proof that her loyalty, patience, and integrity had not gone unnoticed. But even with that validation, she knew that moving forward wasn't about the fortune she now possessed. It was about reclaiming her life and deciding who she wanted to be outside of the shadow of her past. For months, she had traveled, not just to escape, but to rediscover herself. She walked through cobbled streets in old European cities, stood at the edge of vast mountain ranges, and let the sound of the ocean replace the lingering echoes of the courtroom and the voices of those who had doubted her. In every new place, she found pieces of herself that had been lost in years of making herself smaller for Jonathan's sake. She had spent decades supporting someone else's dreams. Now, she was finally allowing herself to dream again. What surprised her most was how little she missed the life she had left behind. There had been a time when she had imagined growing old in that massive house, sitting at the same dining table where she and Jonathan had once celebrated anniversaries, where they had once made plans for a future that never came to be. But looking back, she saw that even in the years they had been together, she had often been alone. Jonathan had been so focused on his ambitions, on his endless desire for more, that he had never truly been present. She had spent years waiting for him to see her, to appreciate her, only to realize that he never would. The day he had walked away had been painful, but it had also been liberating. He had freed her from a life that had been holding her back. Now, she was building something better, something real. She had taken a portion of her inheritance and invested in causes that mattered to her: education programs for young women, financial literacy initiatives, and businesses that supported sustainable innovation. She wasn't just growing her wealth, she was using it to create opportunities for others. She knew what it felt like to be trapped, to feel like someone else had complete control over your future. She wanted to help other women avoid that fate, to give them the knowledge and resources to stand on their own. The most unexpected part of this new chapter was how content she felt being alone. People often asked her if she was looking for love again, if she had thought about remarrying, but she wasn't searching for a new relationship. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel the need to define herself by someone else's presence. Love, if it ever came again, would have to fit into the life she had built, not the other way around. She had spent too many years molding herself to fit into someone else's world. She would never do that again. Every now and then she would hear whispers of Jonathan's downfall. His business had collapsed, his former colleagues had distanced themselves, and the IRS case against him had drained whatever dignity he had left. Samantha Brooks had disappeared the moment his wealth was gone, and now he was nothing more than a cautionary tale in social circles that had once admired him. Evelyn felt nothing when she heard these things. There had been a time when she might have taken satisfaction in his suffering, but now it no longer mattered. His life was no longer connected to hers in any way, and that was the greatest victory of all. One evening, as she sat on the balcony of her new home, watching the sky shift from gold to deep blue, she realized something that made her smile. She was at peace. For so long, she had fought, first for her marriage, then for justice, and finally for herself. But now there was nothing left to fight for. She had won, not in the way Jonathan had once defined winning, but in the way that truly mattered. She had built a life she loved, one that was hers alone. She took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill her lungs, and felt the weight of the past lift entirely. She had not lost anything, she had only gained. And as she raised her glass in a quiet toast to herself, she knew without a doubt that she had not just survived, she had thrived.